Today, I wanted to review an article put out by the Washington Post that touches on a Pentagon memo regarding China, U.S. foreign policy, and I also want to take the opportunity to speculate on the so called division of labor theory, where the collective West, as it were, divides the quote unquote labor of confronting Russia and China at the same time between the Americans and the Europeans, where the Europeans take on at least what the Pentagon, what the foreign policy establishment believes to be a much weaker Russia and keeps them tied down, while the Americans divert their vast resources from their global obligations, particularly in Europe, to a more focused confrontation with China. Not necessarily a direct military confrontation, but certainly an escalation of tension, certainly getting on war footing. And I think this article will have some interesting bits in there that will back up this theory that's been going around. I think primary credit has to go to Brian Berletic for that. He's the one who I believe coined the term division of labor for this policy proposal. And one last thing I will say before I get too deep in the article, before I start reading it, is that I do have another episode of the War Report in the works. Unfortunately, GSP is still not able to join us, so hopefully he will be back soon. But I'm putting together, like I said, some shorter episodes because there's only so much one person can do. And hopefully I can cover all of the news items that just keep coming at us in rapid succession and give fair attention and analysis to each. But without further ado, I'll get into this article right here. So, our title: Secret Pentagon Memo on China. Homeland has heritage fingerprints. Homeland being the leaked memo. An internal guidance memo from Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth focuses on deterring China's seizure of Taiwan and shoring up homeland defense. In some instances, the document is a near word for word facsimile of a report from the conservative think tank behind Project 2025. And before we get into the actual meat and potatoes of the article, I will say just the title and the subtitle. A lot of these more liberal establishment media, for example, the Washington Post, do like to hyperfixate on the Heritage Foundation, but for all the wrong reasons. Right now, they've stumbled their way into being right for the wrong reasons, but make no mistake, their only opposition to this is the optics and the people captaining the ship rather than the actual policy itself. And also for those of you on the right, which is most of my audience, who may have been taken in by the Project 2025 rhetoric beyond just say the jokes about it, you do have to realize beyond the boilerplate conservatism, a lot of it was just straight neocon foreign policy, which may be worth a discussion in and of itself on another day, but I'm not going to get too distracted with that. We're going to get into this. It says it's only 9 minutes to take. Let's see how long it actually takes me to get through it. So, to continue, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has reoriented U.S. military to prioritize deterring China's seizure of Taiwan and shoring up homeland defense by, quote unquote, assuming risk in Europe and other parts of the world, according to a secret internal guidance memo that bears the fingerprints of the conservative Heritage Foundation, including some passages that are nearly word for word duplicates of text published by the think tank last year. This is nothing new. This is the case for every administration. Whenever they are out of office, the think tanks, the people who get paid to write policy, spend their time out of office writing policy, directed up the chain, usually have their people put in key positions in the administration. This is American politics for at least the past 100 years. So this isn't as scandalous or as damning as they like to put it, but I'm not saying that makes it okay. I'm not saying I agree with it, but that's been the name of the game for about a century now, at least since the end of World War II. So, to continue on, the document known as the Interim National Defense Strategic Guidance, marked secret slash no foreign national in most passages, was distributed throughout the Defense Department in mid March and signed by Hegseth. It outlines in broad and sometimes partisan detail the execution of Donald Trump's vision to prepare for and win a potential war against Beijing and defend the United States from threats in the near abroad, including Greenland and Panama Canal. The document setting out prioritization framework for senior defense officials and a vision to execute that work also instructs the military to take a more direct role in countering illegal migration and drug trafficking. And with that, I think you have seen a build up to this for about the past 2 years, ever since the big border crisis under Biden, the one where Texas and some of the other states broke rank and deployed their own National Guards to the border, which was supposed to be a big confrontation between the states and federal government. That did fizzle out. At the time, I thought it was going to have more, let's just say, profound consequences, not some sort of great regime change, but I did think it wouldn't have been swept under the rug so soon. But I suppose that just goes to show how naive I was about the topic about 2 years ago. I believe that was in 2023, if I'm not mistaken. But you will notice with a lot of the rhetoric around the southern border, which, for full disclosure, I think should be completely sealed. I think should be the most well defended border in the world because of the mass migration issues the United States has been facing for decades now. And of course, we should take some sort of punitive action against the drug cartels insofar as it will actually prevent drugs from flowing into this country. But a lot of what you see, particularly coming out of the Pentagon now, is being used as pretext to get the Americans, to get us, deeper involved in Latin America and more entrenched in more forever wars. It's really that simple. And I'm not saying this as somebody who's some great pacifist. Principally, I think that yes, a nation has a right to use military force to defend itself. But when it comes to particular cases, I think you have to realize what's at stake here, who's calling the shots, and what their ultimate goals are. For decades, they had no problem letting drugs and migrants flow in through the southern border. They were more than happy to let that happen. In fact, some even profited off it. Many of them even profited off it. But now they want to do 180 as the world becomes more fractured, as the world becomes, to borrow the overused term, more multipolar. And they'll throw the conservative red meat. They'll make you think that our guys are back in charge in America. But don't be fooled. You can like the good things that come out of the Trump administration or any other right-wing administration or right-wing government. But that does not mean you owe these people your blind loyalty and have to go along and have to quote-unquote trust the plan on everything they do. But to continue, the first Trump administration and the Biden administration characterized China as the greatest threat to the U.S. and postured the force to prepare for and deter a conflict in the Pacific region. But Hegseth's guidance is extraordinary in its description of the potential invasion of Taiwan as the exclusive animating scenario that must be prioritized over potential dangers, reorienting the vast U.S. military architecture towards the Indo-Pacific region and beyond its homeland defense mission. Which is something they've been trying to do for almost 2 decades now. The term Pivot Asia goes back to the first Obama administration. The Pentagon will, quote, assume the risk in other theaters, unquote, given personnel and resource constraints, and pressure its allies in Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia to spend more on defense to take on the bulk of the deterrence role from threats against Russia, North Korea, and Iran, according to the guidance. And you will see this, and I'll discuss this in more detail in the war report. This is combined with some good cop, bad cop rhetoric, like the current U.S. negotiations with Russia, like the current attempts to normalize relations with Russia, where we try to ease pressure on some fronts, we try to come off and give a conciliatory hand. The same thing with the speculated talks about Iran, or Trump bringing up that he wants to meet with Kim Jong-un again, where we will try to alleviate pressures diplomatically while also bolstering Europe, the Middle Eastern states that we're allied with, and other Asia Pacific states in order to, quote unquote, pick up the slack that the U.S. military establishment can no longer. The agency will shift to focus on counterterrorism missions against groups with the capability and intent to strike the U.S., the guidance says, signaling it will deprioritize militants in the Middle East and Africa who are regionally destabilizing but do not have the ambition to launch international attacks. Quite funny given the current campaign against the Houthis. Now I know they'll claim about international trade, whatever. But also on that note, they're trying to push the Saudis back into forming a coalition with the other Gulf states to take on the bulk of the fighting in Yemen. A return to the status quo that we saw in the Obama years, in the early Trump years. China is the department's sole pacing threat. Denial of a Chinese fait accompli. Sorry, I had to do the accent. I'm a sucker for it. I apologize if you don't appreciate the way I do, but I digress. Seizure of Taiwan while also simultaneously defending the U.S. homeland is the department's sole pacing scenario, Hegseth wrote. Its force planning construct, a concept of how the Pentagon will build and resource the armed services to take on the perceived threats, will consider conflict only with Beijing when planning contingencies for a major power war. It says, leaving the threat from Moscow largely attended by European allies, who we all know are completely at the beck and call of the U.S. There's no real independent force. Nobody in any European country of consequence, with all due respect to Hungary and Slovakia with their respective leaderships, no European country of consequence is going to start its own rapprochement with the Russians. No European country of consequence is going to pick up the phone and call Putin and talk about serious ceasefire terms or reconciliation between the two power blocs. Where the Biden administration's 2022 national defense strategy emphasized alliances in countering Russia's aggression, calling for, quote, mutually beneficial alliances and allies, our greatest global strategic advantage, end quote, the Hegseth interim guidance says NATO must take on, quote, far greater, unquote, burden sharing because the U.S. will be reluctant to provide the forces with its priorities focused elsewhere. The Defense Department did not return a request for comment. And the Biden administration was the last real administration living in the delusion of hegemonic American power that we saw in the 90s, in the early 2000s, where love or hate Trump, love or hate Hegseth, I have plenty to say about both, one much more negative than the other. They at least have come to the understanding about what the facts on the ground are and are actually moving to address that. You don't have to like the solutions. I certainly don't. That's why I'm here criticizing them. But it is, dare I say, refreshing to see a more realistic appraisal of the situation. The guidance was provided to congressional national security committees, where Republicans and Democrats have described it as confusing, according to a congressional aide who reviewed the document. It calls for withdrawing from a presence in most of the world, including the Middle East, but administration is focused on demonstrating firepower and deterrence against the Houthis in Yemen and pressuring Iran, the aide noted. Number one, a lot of that can be explained by the elephant in the room, which is the Israel lobby and the Israeli insistence that America provide a security umbrella for them and them alone in the Middle East. And number two, it's not quite as easy, just speaking objectively, to completely reorient forces from one front to another. And I haven't read this document. It's far too long, far too meaty for my taste. We'd be here all day if I did, especially if I did it in a video to go through it piece by piece. But it's also reasonable, once again, not to defend the policy, but it's reasonable, objectively speaking, to tie up loose ends in one front and proceed to another. And that's why you see such a push for the ceasefire negotiations with Russia. They need a neat little bow that then the Europeans and the quote-unquote Middle Eastern allies can deal with on their terms once the U.S. shifts the Indo-Pacific, which is a monumental task. It's not going to happen overnight. We've been trying to do this for almost 20 years. But to continue, there's a tension between we want American strength and military dominance in the world, and we want to be everywhere but also nowhere, the aide said, speaking on the condition of anonymity to discuss the sensitive document. And that's inconsistent and going to be difficult for them to design a strategy around. That's a fair point. I've said this many times about Trump's foreign policy in both his first and second terms. It is schizophrenic. It is incoherent. And that has been to our advantage sometimes. It's also been to our great detriment sometimes. You have to take what you can get. But I don't want to defend Trump too much because I think a lot of what he's been doing has been disappointing, to say the least. But him having a, I suppose, schizophrenic foreign policy or a bit of inconsistency is part of the reason I thought he was preferable, because he's not going to be able to set a coherent agenda towards the American empire, which is detrimental to us all. So I will take some level of incompetence if it means curtailing the reaches of the American empire and curtailing the conflicts and the scenarios we can get ourselves into. Now, of course, that doesn't avoid it altogether. We have doubled down in Yemen, but at the same time, we've also pulled back just the slightest bit in Ukraine, which might be all worth it. I don't know. We have to see the outcome of that. But I do think there's an argument to be made that Trump's incoherence and his inconsistencies, at least when in practice, do work somewhat to our advantage. And that's not to the American empire's advantage, full disclosure. That's the advantage of people like you and me who have to live with the consequences being under the umbrella of this empire and having half our income taken, not to sound too much like a libertarian, in order to prop up a system that brings us no benefits. The interim guidance is 9 pages. Several passages through it are similar to a longer 2024 report by the Heritage Foundation, some of which are nearly identical according to the Washington Post analyst of both documents. Once the Heritage Foundation co-authors, Alex Velez Green is now in an interim role in the Pentagon top policy official. Once again, that's just business as usual. Think tank to administration to think tank to lobbyist. It's the life cycle of American politics, the life cycle of politics in many, quote unquote, liberal democratic nations. And sure, it's worth pointing out, I'm glad they pointed it out, but the narrative that they try to spin is that it's much more scandalous, at least in my opinion, than it actually is. Because even though, like I said, there's a lot of criticism to be had of Trump here, I'm here partaking in it, they will result to the petty gotchas. Which bothers me because there are actual items of consequence to criticize Trump on. But once again, these people, they don't care. It's just a matter of approach. It's a matter of minutia because they all have the same goal. Nobody is really principally opposed to this writing in the Washington Post, at least to my knowledge. I could be wrong. If there's one voice out there, I apologize to whoever that might be, but I don't see it. The Heritage Report, published in August, recommends that the Pentagon prioritize 3 core issues: Taiwan invasion deterrence, homeland defense, and increased burden sharing among allies and partners, which Hegseth guidance mirrors. The congressional aide said it was readily apparent to Capitol Hill that the staff of the document bore influence of the conservative think tank. The Heritage Foundation did not return requests for comment. Trump is a presidential candidate, denied the Heritage Project's 2025 plan, which touted a far right, very dangerous, very spooky, transition agenda across the entirety of the federal government and was a blueprint for his second term. But his policies and appointment, including the Pentagon guidance, have made clear that the heritage plans have been deeply influential in the first months of his administration. Yeah, I can agree to that. The so-called scary far-right Project 2025 has been influential in the administration, despite Trump's denials, because that's how this ecosystem works. I'm not going to explain it again. I think you all get the point by now. But them hand-wringing over how scary the boilerplate Heritage 2025 project is, it, it cracks me up a little, it disgusts me a little, and I really don't know what else to say because they've been hammering on at this point. It's boilerplate conservatism. It might have a cool, right-wing populist flair to it to sucker some people like us who maybe have a bit too much optimism into supporting such a program, but at the end of the day, this is this is boilerplate neocon stuff as we're seeing right now. Sure, it might take a different flavor. Sure, they might have to adjust for some realities on the ground, but none of this is a real break in continuity from the past 40 years of American policy. Senior U.S. military officials directly tied Heritage's vision to Hegseth's guidance. Major General Garrick Harmon, the head of strategy plans at Africa Command, recommended to staff that they read the Heritage Report as part of the discussion on how to align the priorities of the new Pentagon guidance. According to the command staff member who spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss the internal deliberations, another official within the command distributed a copy of the Heritage Report, the staff member said. The recommendation did not appear on partisan in nature, the staff member said, adding that the similarities suggest the Pentagon's document was partly inspired by the Heritage Foundation report and that the information could be complementary to understanding Hegseth's guidance. And something you will notice a lot of these articles, they like to pad it out and say the same thing about 3 times over. But to continue, Africa Command declined to comment on internal discussions, but said staff members meet with experts on Africa to inform planning, said Kelly Callahan, a spokesperson for the command. The staff also regularly reads and shares publicly available research and reports, she said. As with all prudent military planning, we are continually leveraging the latest research to assess and develop our strategy. Hegseth recently visited the Pacific region to emphasize his priorities against China, telling every service member in Guam that they are, quote, the tip of the spear, unquote, for U.S. military operations. The new Pentagon guidance for, quote, denial defense, unquote, of Taiwan includes the increase of troop presence through submarines, bombers, unmanned ships, specialty units from the Army and Marine Corps, as well as a greater focus on bombs that destroy reinforced and subterranean targets. The plan also called for improving defense of U.S. troop locations in the Indo-Pacific, generating pre-positioned stocks and improving logistics. While emphasizing support to deter Chinese attack on Taiwan, the document also calls for, quote, pressuring Taipei to significantly increase its defense spending. Trump and his allies have criticized Taiwan in underinvesting in its own defense, urging the self-ruled island to spend up to 10% of its GDP on military readiness, a proportion well above what the US and the allies spend on defense. And this is typical of Trump, demanding that the vassals pay more and more into the empire's projects. And something interesting to note about Taiwan and the defense of Taiwan is something I bring up a lot, something I think is worth bringing up a lot, is that the Taiwan issue, politically speaking, is not settled. There is still a rather large contingent in Taiwan that is in favor of diplomacy with the mainland. Reunification elements might be small, they might be minuscule, especially under the Chinese Communist Party or the Communist Party of China more formally. But unification elements on conditions and status quo elements do exist. Mind you, despite everything, despite the status of Taiwan, according to the Chinese, as a breakaway province, they're still the largest trading partner. Taiwan still has China's largest trading partner. And the amount of imports, the amount of support they rely on from mainland China, it can't be supplemented by the West. It can't be supplemented by Japan. There's really nobody else in the region who can support Taiwan, who can make up for the trade volumes that the Taiwanese put out. And that just, when you get down to brass tacks, the idea of a conflict between China and Taiwan with US and co's backing is exceedingly unlikely unless they somehow get a radical pro-independence movement in Taiwan. Now, color revolutions are not out of the purview of the American Empire. We've seen them many times over, particularly in the former Soviet Union, particularly in Eastern Europe, and even some places in the Middle East. But it should be noted that U.S. aid was not abolished, that these instruments of soft power were not abolished. They were restructured, they were reorganized, they were reassigned to different departments. A lot of this is directly under the control of the State Department now, which is headed by Rubio. So Rubio was also a longtime China hawk, so I'm sure he has his agenda with this, which is much in line with Trump and Hegseth's agenda, where hypothetically, yes, they could push a radical pro-independence movement in Taiwan, but as it stands now, the political climate in Taiwan is still too divided between pro-status quo forces and truly pro-independence forces in order for this plan to take place, which why I think you're seeing this pressure. I think it's beyond just GDP to military spending. I think it's beyond some of the factors brought up here, but there are deeper elements at play, and that a lot of the glow ops, so to speak, that we saw in places in the former Soviet Union, led by the State Department, led by people like Victoria Nuland, those are going to shift to East Asia. And you see this happening in Korea right now. South Korea, with the current dispute, which I'll cover on the next episode of the War Report, the situation with the impeachment of Yoon, etc., and the U.S. digging its heels further and further into East Asia. Not that we haven't been deeply entrenched in the region before, but even beyond what we have seen in the past. But to continue, Since taking office, he has dodged the question of whether U.S. would allow Beijing to take the island by force. Two people familiar with Taiwan's official discussions has said that the government in Taipei has struggled to make inroads with the new U.S. administration amid growing doubts about Washington's support. Concerns intensified after February's disastrous Oval Office meeting of Trump, Vice President Vance, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. I think they left off about 4 or 5 Ys. That just doesn't look right to me. But this is the point I was going to bring up. At least the way the rest of the world sees it, they see the Americans throwing Ukraine under the bus. Now, when you look at what's actually happening, that's not the case. Support has continued more or less unabated. Sure, external relations have soured. Sure, the Americans look a lot more transactional than they did under the Biden administration. But when it comes to the reality on the ground, of course, support is still flowing to Ukraine. ISR is still flowing to Ukraine. But as far as, say, the Taiwanese or other American vassals or American allies in the regions might see it, they might look at that as an example of what's to stop them from using us as the next cannon fodder before being cast under the bus. And which, in many ways, that is what happened to Ukraine. But I think the idea of the abandonment of Ukraine is overstated. But the sentiments are understandable, which goes back to my point about Taiwan's internal political discourse. When they see such a what they perceive to be unreliable U.S., are they going to pick a fight with China the same way that, say, Ukraine picked a fight with Russia? That's the real question. That's the $1 million question here. In a message of reassurance to Washington, President Lei Ching-te said last week that Taiwan will boost its defense spending over 3% of its GDP, up around 2.5% as part of an ongoing overhaul of its military infrastructure. China responded by launching a wave of fighter jets and ships near the island, warning that those who play with fire will get burned. I love Chinese diplomatic statements because they're always of these great consequence, but China's foreign policy in reality is actually quite measured, and some might actually say a bit too measured. I will refrain from comment on that point, but to continue, in 2023, U.S. analysts concluded that Taiwan's forces would be unlikely to thwart Chinese military air superiority, according to a leaked classified document. Hegseth's guidance synchronizes the Pentagon with some of Trump's international fixations, describing undetermined threats from the, quote, near abroad. U.S. forces, he wrote, must be ready to defend American interests wherever they may be threatened in our hemisphere, from Greenland to the Panama Canal to the Cape Horn. Once again, you get this doubling down on the idea of turning North America into a fortress, which will play into some of the tariff policy trying to reindustrialize America, which, once again, I'll discuss in further detail on the next episode of the War Report. Trump told reporters Friday, "We have to have Greenland, escalating tensions with Denmark, a NATO ally that governs the foreign policy and defense of the island. The guidance directs military leaders to ensure access to the Panama Canal and take a more assertive role in combating drug trafficking, border protection, and deportations, which are normally carried out by DHS. Those details were previously reported by CNN and NBC News. It also covers the expansion of the U.S. nuclear forces and homeland missile defense through the still conceptual Golden Dome, as described by Trump. Of course, it's got to be the Golden Dome instead of the Iron Dome, which is one of Trump's campaign promises, was a updated missile defense system, which could be foreboding. It could be that they are expecting the worst when it comes to confrontation with Russia and or China, that there might be ICBMs launched. I'd like to think that's not the case, but with the direction things are going, you can never be so sure. I mean, even during the Cold War, diplomatic tensions were not this high, and there were a lot more skilled diplomats back then. I do not feel the same about today. Rubio is no Kissinger. Think what you will about Kissinger. He was a competent diplomat. He was somebody who would have been able to sidestep a nuclear war, in my opinion. I don't see that from Rubio. I don't see that from Waltz or Hegseth, or even Witkoff, who I don't particularly dislike as much as the other ones. I have my problems with him. I have my reservations about him, but I don't even think Witkoff could talk. And it doesn't help that he's not really a diplomat by trade, or that the United States doesn't really have many diplomats by trade. Unlike in Russia, where you have somebody like Lavrov, or unlike in China, where you have somebody like Wang Yi. People who are career diplomats and people who occupy their foreign ministry, not because of political favors or political appointments. Well, of course that's part of that, but not primarily because of political favors or political appointments, but because of continuity of policy explicitly stated so, and people who are skilled and experienced diplomats who probably could talk their way out of nuclear war, which is probably the most important job of a diplomat in the 20th and the 21st century. Hegseth's guidance acknowledges the U.S. is unlikely to provide substantial, if any, support to Europe in the case of a Russian military advances, noting Washington intends to push NATO allies to take primary defense of the region. The U.S. will support Europe with nuclear deterrence of Russia, and NATO should only count on U.S. forces not required for homeland defense or China in deterrence missions, the document says. Which is why you still see some small contingents of troops in Europe, but they are wanting to shift the burden onto Europe, the military burden, while also denying them the level of sovereignty that would be afforded to that. Which does make me understand some of the frustrations of the Europeans that they're expected to build this EU army and, if need be, march into Russia and fight this cataclysmic war, but they're also expected to play along with every foreign policy whim of the United States, but in a way that is self-inflicted. Look at their own policy towards Russia. I'll say once again, Macron, now at the risk of his political career and maybe even his own neck, depending on how deeply embedded certain intelligence networks are in France, Macron can pick up the phone and call Putin instead of playing the strategic ambiguity game. Olaf Scholz can. Maybe even Meloni. I don't want to ascribe too much power to the Italians within the European structure. But point being is there's multiple politicians across Europe who could pick up that phone, who could sit down at the table with Russia and work out a real comprehensive peace deal, independent of the Americans wanting them to be the next wave of attack after Ukraine fails, which in many ways, maybe not Trump himself, but some of the people he surrounds himself with, it does look like that's what they want to do. So to continue, to the end of the article, it appears, a significant increase in Europe sharing its defense burden, the document says, quote, will also ensure NATO can reliably deter or defeat Russian aggression even if deterrence fails and the United States is already engaged or must withhold forces to deter a primary conflict in another region. Well, that's our Washington Post article. I think it covered some points that we all already knew, similar to the New York Times article, just much more concise and about a different topic. But it did lay out the so-called division of labor theory. And if this is truly a Pentagon memo, which Washington Post claims it is, I didn't see a link to it in the article, maybe I overlooked it, but I'm willing to take Gad's word that these were leaked from the Pentagon and that these came from the Heritage Foundation. This has been the plan, it seems, that they want to divide and conquer when it comes to Russia and China, because they know they aren't going to manufacture or, more appropriately, exploit another Sino-Russian split, so they have to have two different blocks confront on two different points. Even though you look at some of the things coming out of, for example, the Defense Intelligence Reports or any other even publicly available documents from the Pentagon or the State Department, or even Cavoli's testimony in Congress. We're setting up the Europeans to march directly into a meat grinder. They've admitted the Russians are not having forced mobilization, at least in the same way the Ukrainians are. Their military capacity has far exceeded what anyone would have expected from them. Their economy is just fine. In fact, it's growing at a reasonable pace. And they would trounce Europe in any real conflict. Look at the supply outputs of the Europeans. It's just non-existent compared to the Russians. And if you want to look at the militarization plan of somebody like Friedrich Merz, who is slated to take office in Germany whenever the transition of government actually happens, I'm not sure when the exact date on that is going to be, it is extreme austerity measures across the European continent in order to invest in a military to confront a threat that doesn't exist, to fight a war of choice. Imposing severe austerity measures on a population to fight a war of necessity can work, in many cases does work. But if you want to march into a foreign adventure and demand people give up, say, healthcare funding, pension funding, infrastructure, a number of the social programs that the European states pride themselves on, and, with some degree, rightfully so. They want that. The Pentagon wants them to piss that all away, and many in Europe who are willing to do that as well, in order to relitigate these conflicts, in order to tie the Russians down, while the Americans pursue, in what in my opinion is a very self-destructive position against the Chinese. Yes, sure, you can talk about, say, Chinese economic influence in the U.S. if you want to really make the best argument you can. You can talk about Chinese influence in Canada, whatever. Yes, there's a lot of Chinese money tied up in the U.S., tied up in the West, but that's also part of why we have so much spending power. That is as part of the reality, and this gets back into the tariff talk, which I'll talk about in the next episode of the War Report. But really, on both sides of this, they want the Europeans to march into a bloody war against the Russians that serves no real benefit to them, and they want the Americans to do the same against China, North Korea, in the Asia Pacific. They want the Arabs to do so against the Iranians, so on and so forth. And once again, a lot of these wars, in fact, all of these wars, would all be wars of choice and not wars of necessity, which trying to sell a population on paying such severe cost for a war of choice is simply not going to happen. You can fight them when they're little colonial engagements. Sure, Iraq and Afghanistan had their backlashes in the U.S., but not too many people were going to starve themselves or riot over the fact that we had a troop surge in Afghanistan in 2010. Vietnam, when they're conducting a draft, when they are dedicating actual national resources to fighting a war overseas, a war of choice overseas, then you're going to get the draft riots, then you're going to get the social instability, and they want to implement that on a scale that is magnitudes more than I think any of us could ever imagine. Uh, Not seen since World War II, and given how complex warfare has become, how complex weapon systems become, how complex supply chains have become, it would dwarf World War II. And that's what these people want to march us into. Sure, you can talk about deterrence, you can talk about whatever, but at the end of the day, these are war plans. This is a war agenda. I'm not saying this is going to happen under Trump. Maybe under one of his successors, maybe somebody will manufacture this crisis, but these things usually take years to manufacture, as it were. But they do want a final confrontation with China because they failed to defeat them diplomatically, they failed to defeat them economically. Now they must resort to defeating them militarily in order to maintain what is left of their empire, which paradoxically would also be the undoing of that very empire they're seeking to preserve. But I hope you got something out of that article. I hope I was able to articulate my position at least well enough for you guys to understand what I'm getting at here. And I'll see you guys on the upcoming War Report episode, and goodbye.